Starting from this video, we will move on to the chapter on carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are one of the four important biomolecules. Carbohydrates will provide food to us, which will give us energy. And the food is mainly from the starch. The carbohydrates are called starch. And the carbohydrates also are the structural components of the walls of plant cells and the wood of trees. And the carbohydrates here mainly refer to cellulose. Then carbohydrates also have the function to store genetic information or transfer genetic information. For DNA and RNA, part of the structure involve carbohydrates. So, to learn the structure of carbohydrates and understand the reactions of carbohydrates are very important. Now, what are carbohydrates? From the organic chemistry point of view, we say carbohydrates are polyhydroxyaldehydes and ketones, or compounds that yield polyhydroxyaldehyde ketones upon hydrolysis. So this definition is based on the structure, polyhydroxyaldehydes and ketones. The general formula for carbohydrates: CmH2nOn. So basically, the number of hydrogens and oxygens will be in the ratio of 2 to 1. For simple carbohydrates, M and M may be the same number. For example, C6H12O6. That's the formula for glucose. M and N are the same. They both equal to 6 in glucose. Another way to look at the carbohydrates is if M and N are equal, we can put it down as CH2O with N units of this. Okay, so this is how the name carbohydrates come from, because it's carbon with water. We say carbohydrates are like the hydrates of carbon. That's why we call it carbohydrates. Okay? Two examples of carbohydrates. D-glucose. You have seen this structure before. And then D-fructose. D-glucose has an aldehyde functional group on carbon 1. There are 6 carbons, and for the rest of the carbons from 5 to 6, each has an OH group attached to it. For D-fructose, it has a ketone functional group on carbon 2, and for the rest of the carbon atoms, there are OH groups on each of the carbon. Both of these two structures have the same formula, C6H12O6, so they are isomers of each other, right? So basically, carbohydrates have large number of functional groups. One functional group on each carbon. Now let's take a look at the classification of carbohydrates. We classify carbohydrates in 4 categories: monosaccharides, disaccharides, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. Monosaccharides are those simple carbohydrates. It's a single polyhydroxyaldehyde or ketone unit, and the monosaccharides cannot be broken down by hydrolysis. Monosaccharides typically will contain 3 to 7 carbon atoms, with 5 and 6 most common. And monosaccharides will be water soluble, and they are white crystalline solids. For disaccharides, there are 2 monosaccharide units covalently bonded to each other. For example, sucrose is a disaccharide, and the sucrose are formed by 1 unit of glucose and 1 unit of fructose. There are 2 monosaccharide units. For oligosaccharides, there are 3 to 10 monosaccharide units covalently bound to each other. Oligo means a few, right? So this a few generally is 3 to 10. Oligosaccharides are associated with proteins and lipids, so they have the structural and regulatory functions. And lastly, polysaccharides. Poly means many. There are more than 10 monosaccharide units, and generally this will be several thousand units. There are 3 categories of polysaccharides: cellulose, starch, and glycogen, and we will talk about them more in detail later. So now let's focus on monosaccharides. Monosaccharides can be classified based on different criteria, but when we call these compounds, we always use the OSE ending in their names, like glucose has an OSE ending, fructose, sucrose, okay, they all end with OSE. All right, based on the number of carbon atoms, we can classify monosaccharides as triose for the ones with 3 carbon atoms, tetrose for 4 carbons, pentose 5 carbon atoms, hexose, and heptose. We will see some examples later. And based on what functional group is present in a monosaccharide, we can classify them as aldose and ketones. Aldose are polyhydroxyaldehydes, and ketones are polyhydroxyketones. The classification based on carbon atoms and functional groups, these two can be combined. For example, we could have an aldohexose. Glucose is an aldohexose. It has 6 carbons and an aldehyde functional group. We can have ketohexose, like fructose is a ketohexose, 6 carbons with a ketone functional group. We can also have aldopentose, etc. Right, we will see some examples. All right. So now let's take a look at the Fisher projection for carbohydrates, for monosaccharides. From now on, you will see some structures of carbohydrates. And the structures that I'm showing in the video, you will have to know them by the structure and by the names. All right? So let's start with the simplest monosaccharides, the one that has 3 carbon atoms. So I've put down 2 structures here. The first one, 3 carbons, aldehyde functional group on carbon 1, and carbon 2 and 3 each has an OH, right? The second one, ketone functional group on carbon 2, and on carbon 1 and 3 there are OH groups. So the first structure is an aldyl triose. The second structure is the keto triose. All right. For the aldyl triose, the name is R plus glyceraldehyde. And we define the stereochemistry as the D. We also call it D-glyceraldehyde. And this definition for D is arbitrary here for the aldyl triose. We just call the structure, this structure shown here, when you have the H on the left side of the Fischer projection, OH on the right side in the Fischer projection. We just define this as the D configuration. This is used before the RS configuration system was used. Anyway, the IUPAC nomenclature for this aldyl triose is 2,3-dihydroxypropanol. All right, and this is the only aldyl triose available. The name for the keto triose, dihydroxyacetone. It's the only keto triose. And what is interesting about this keto triose is, even though we put it down in Fischer projection, it is an achiral compound. Okay, and it is the only monosaccharides that is achiral. Moving on, next we will take a look at aldyl tetrose. 4 carbon atoms with an aldehyde functional group. The IUPAC name for aldyl tetrose will be 2,3,4-trihydroxybutanol. The structure shown here is the D-erythrose. In D-erythrose, carbon 2 and 3 are chiral, and the OH groups will be on the right-hand side in the Fischer projection. Its enantiomer, its mirror image, will be called the L-erythrose. The next isomer is called D-threose. The 2 OH groups on the chiral carbon will be on the opposite side in the Fischer projection. And its mirror image is the L-threose. Okay, so there are 4 stereoisomers for aldyl tetrose. And if you remember from Chapter 3, when we talk about the stereochemistry, the maximum number of stereoisomers will be 2 to the power of n, and n is the number of the chiral centers. For aldyl tetrose, there are 2 chiral centers, so 2 to the power of 2 will be 4. And we do have 4 stereoisomers. Now regarding the D and L configuration. remember in the aldyl trials, the one with 3 carbon atoms, we define the D configuration is the one that has the OH on the right side in Fischer projection. Then we will relate all the other D configuration to that one that we defined it arbitrarily. So the D configuration for the rest of the carbohydrates will be defined as the configuration at the highest numbered stereogenic center. And that is the same as the D-glyceraldehyde, which means on the right-hand side in Fischer projection. Okay, does that make sense? So basically, we are looking at this carbon atom. If the OH group right here is on the right-hand side, it's the D. Okay, we are looking at the last chiral center, the highest numbered stereo center in the Fischer projection. And if it's on the left side, then that will be an L sugar. All right. So next, aldyl pentose. 5 carbon atoms with the aldehyde functional group. There will be 3 stereocenters, so there are 8 stereoisomers. You only need to know one of the aldyl pentose. This is the D-ribose. D-ribose is part of RNA. RNA is the abbreviation of ribonucleic acid. Okay, and the D-ribose is also part of ATP, the energy source for our body. For aldyl hexose, 6 carbons with the aldehyde functional group, there are 4 stereocenters, so 16 stereoisomers. You need to know 2 out of these 16. And this structure, you've seen it many times already. This is D-glucose, or we also call it dextrose. Dextrose actually means D-glucose will rotate the plane of plane polarized light to the right-hand side. So its optical rotation will be positive. Okay, so that's the name, how the name is from, dextrose. And the D-glucose is also the blood sugar. It's the most abundant carbohydrates and the most important one. The second one you need to know is called D-galactose. The only difference between D-glucose and D-galactose is on carbon 4. Galactose has the opposite stereo center at carbon 4. So we also say D-galactose is a C4 epimer of D-glucose. Epimer means there is only one chiral center that's different, and the rest of the chiral centers will be the same. So D-galactose and D-glucose will differ by the chiral center on carbon 4 only. Galactose is also called the brain sugar, and the galactose is also half of the lactose. Next, we will take a look at a ketose. This is D-fructose. it's a 2-ketohexose, which means it has 6 carbons, but it has a ketone functional group on carbon 2. Fructose is also called the fruit sugar or levulose, as compared to dextrose. Dextrose, for D-glucose, it has the positive rotation, while fructose has the negative rotation. Its optical rotation is counterclockwise, negative. And the fructose is the sweetest sugar of all. It's sweeter than sucrose, our table sugar.